Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. It's a very exciting night, the 16th night of the blessed month of Ramadan. Dr. Mahan and I have the incredible pleasure of having Ustadha Tahera Ahmad with us, both a scholar and a spiritual caregiver within the community, and also an incredibly gifted Qur'an reciter. And so tonight we're so blessed to have you with us. Thank you for joining us, Tahera.
Assalamu alaikum to both of you. It's an honor to, mashallah, be in both of your company, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Yeah, the honor is ours. This is really fantastic that you could join us. You know, we were going to play the video, but I wonder if instead of the video, we just have the recitation. Or should we do the video as well?
It's up to you. I because the video is my voice, I get tired of it really quickly, but I think that we could front and center the recitation, and I think that's a great idea. And you know, the one thing, or there are many things we don't get to in these brief episodes that we're doing as a way of celebrating the gifting of the Qur'an to humankind during the month of Ramadan, and also as a way of, as Dr. Mahan's teacher, Dr. Asrar, said, as a way of giving the Qur'an its due, and really you know, struggling with it and exploring it and cherishing it. I know I love it when Dr. Mahan reads it and loves to emphasize those rhyming schemes, and it's clear that it's with so much delight and love that he's doing that. So all of that is beautiful, but the one thing that we haven't really talked about is the sonic experience of the recitation of the Qur'an, which even long before I knew very much Arabic, was so profoundly stirring and so profoundly impactful for me, and is for so many others. And so tonight we have the great blessing of having Ustadha Tahera with us, who can open us up with a sonic experience of the Quran in living recitation.
Yeah, we're in the 16th juz today, but we're still wrapping up some of the 15th, quite a bit of the 15th, and so we'll recite from some of yesterday's reading, maybe Surat Bani Israel, Surat Isra, and which specific ayats, Ustadha?
We're going to, inshallah, recite, I'm just going to recite very few verses from the last portion of Surat Isra, from 78. So from Aqim as-salata liduluki shams to, let's see.
89 would be great.
Let's stop at 80. Or, yeah, we could even stop at 82 if we need, because of time, I think. Okay. Because we also have to recite maybe some parts of Surah Kahf. So.
Okay.
All right.
So as Dr. Timothy mentioned, you know, subhanAllah, as we're experiencing Ramadan every single day, I'm sure many of you attend the Taraweeh at night, and often during Taraweeh, the Qur'an is recited pretty quickly because of trying to complete the entire recitation of the Qur'an within 29 or 30 days. But really, the Qur'an is meant to be an experience, even in a recitation form. So, for example, when you first start learning the recitation, your teachers will actually have you do breathing exercises. And there's actually research being done within therapy models of how does the Qur'an actually allow for there to be a moment of pause, and the breathing, how it can actually have a physiological impact on us. So there are studies now on how serotonin is impacted, how dopamine is impacted in our body at the physiological level, because we are actually, 90% almost water. And I'm sure you've heard of like water crystallization, right? Both of you have heard of the water crystallization experimentation that's going on even currently at Harvard University. So what I'm trying to say is that as I'm reading, you'll hear those pauses, you'll hear the breathing, and it's really, subhanAllah, it's meant to be something that allows you to just like deeply connect with your own breath. And in doing so, you're actually pushing out, like what I like to think about it as, you're taking in breath and then you're taking out all of the toxins literally as you're reciting. So I know that that may be a little bit of a longer conversation for now, but I wanted to at least give you that as a preface for those of us who are experiencing this maybe for the first time. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أقم الصلاة لدلوك الشمس إلى غسق الليل وقرآن الفجر إن قرآن الفجر كان مشهودا ومن الليل فتهجد به نافلة لك عسى ومن الليل فتهجد به نافلة لك عسى أن يبعثك ربك مقاما محمودا وقل رب أدخلني مدخل صدق وأخرجني مخرج صدق وقل رب أدخلني مدخل صدق وأخرجني مخرج صدق واجعل لي من لدنك سلطانا نصيرا وقل جاء الحق وزهق الباطل إن الباطل كان زهوقا وننزل من القرآن ما هو شفاء ورحمة للمؤمنين ولا يزيد الظالمين إلا خسارا صدق الله العظيم. Apologies for the breaking of almost my breath. Typically when I'm reciting for programs, I actually don't eat that day. And of course we had iftar like literally an hour ago.
And we couldn't tell. It was incredible. Thank you.
You know, Ustadha Tahera, just one question about the experience. I mean, you know, I know that musicians talk about being in the zone, like jazz musicians talk about entering into a space where you are kind of one with the sound and the music and what's happening. Do you feel when you're reciting Qur'an that you're also kind of in the zone and you become a sort of a vehicle or a channel through which the recitation passes through? I mean, what is the experience of having this beautiful recitation come through you?
Well, for many years, I my concentration was so much on like, oh, what maqam am I reading in? Am I doing this right? Am I pronouncing this part right? And am I like at the technical, right? When you think about being an instrument, you're looking at the technicality of all the tools, so to speak, right? And so I would get so caught up in that. But I think now, alhamdulillah, it's come to a point where the recitation should move you, right? Like it should actually, so the maqam you're representing and how you're reciting it is how we think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is expressing this to us, right? So, and this is why we have the maqams, is like when there's a verse that's about hellfire, you're not going to recite it in the same way, right? Like for those of us who are learning this for the first time, think of it as like, the tone that we use when we talk about certain imagery or certain scenery. So, and it's so interesting. Whenever I do this with non-Muslims, even when they don't know what I'm reciting, they're like, it's almost like they know exactly what I'm reciting, right? So it's like they can tell, oh, those were verses that were probably admonishing, us. Those are verses that are warning us about something. Those are verses that are about, tajri min tahtiha al-anhar, and like you could feel that, you can sense that a little bit.
Okay, so
gardens underneath which rivers flow.
Yes, the paradise verses about paradise.
Yeah.
And also,
sorry.
Just a quick word for those who may not have access to the Arabic. What is a maqam? Can you explain that just for a second, and then we'll jump into our unscripted.
Yeah, so that is a much obviously longer conversation. And I know we're already you said we're kind of trying to keep on the night of the Qur'an so that we can, but think of it like scales, right? Like it's like the scale that you're reciting in. So, and it's the weight of the scale that you're giving the tone. So basically it's like the way in which you're reciting something is I guess if someone is studying music theory, that would be a little bit easier to understand. But if you haven't, then it's think of it like a scale that you're reciting on. But these verses, I don't know.
Go ahead.
So the verses themselves, though, like these verses are absolutely just so beautiful, right? I mean, I'm sure both of you had a chance to look at it, and I've listened to you talk about the recitation of or the revelation, of Surah Isra, and that it like I'm not sure if you talked about the asbab an-nuzul, like the reason of the revelation of the surah. I think you did, and that it was
we haven't done asbab much. So go ahead, let's get into that, and then also the reading of the text itself.
And again, just to make sure everything is clear and in English. When we talk about the asbab, remember we all remember that the Quran was revealed little by little over 23 years. And so sometimes the occasions or the situation of what was happening on the ground at the time of the revelation of particular verses really helps to illuminate what's going on in the Quranic text. And because these verses are not arranged chronologically, and sometimes they were revealed at different times and in different contexts, sometimes the Quran can shift in very dramatic and sudden ways without us knowing what's going on if we haven't studied sort of those verses in relation to these historical contexts that became the context in which those particular verses were revealed. So tell
us about the context of revelation of this particular surah.
So I think I listened yesterday. You had mentioned, we know that this is part of the Mi'raj of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Right.
Most or many scholars think it's revealed around right around the Am al-Huzn, like the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's nightly journey is directly in some correlation to the fact that he had lost very close members of his family, and that prayer and salah was a gift really for the Prophet ﷺ, and the nightly journey was in a way something that allowed him for him to have an ascension from the worries and the anxieties and whatever was bringing him down in terms of the state of what we call depression and postmodernity, right? This idea of what's pushing you down, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is taking that off of him and bringing him up. And so the mi'raj of the believer is when we do salah, when we push our hands away and we enter into this dimension in which we are in connection to the divine and nothing else matters. And in essence, it is our way of saying, we this is why we have a focus. We have the qibla. And if you study like a lot of the Near Eastern traditions, and particularly like in Theravada Buddhism, I'm sure you've maybe like heard this, that the idea of like focusing and putting your shoulders towards something is very meaningful as a guiding principle to focus. So we do that, and we also have our hands right on our like in tashahhud state. There's so much research now being done on like what happens when you're in that very like calm state, right? And you're putting your hands on. And I'm sorry, I know I'm a chaplain, so I'm going to mention some of these like mental health kind of connections, if that's okay with both of you. I know you guys are academics. So we already know all of that, right? We know that Surah Isra is revealed for that reason. Primarily, and then this is the end of Surah Isra, right? And what's beautiful to me about this is it's reminding us that the Qur'an needs to be continued as part of the actual salah. So when it says aqim as-salah, right, to rise yourself into a state, and then if you notice it says wa Qur'an al-Fajr, that the Qur'an of Fajr, and so many scholars believe that this means the Qur'an that we recite in Salat al-Fajr, and that this will be mashhud, that this will be a witness for us. So as we're coming to a close in the surah, it's the idea and the way I'm doing tadabbur on this, and I understand that that's kind of what we've been doing every single night here, is just thinking and pondering together about, isn't that, subhanAllah, so beautiful that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ending these verses and reminding us that even if there's, other prayers that for example, it says liduluki shams ila ghasaq al-layl, but the Qur'an of Fajr, there's something very special about that. Now,
Right.
we can ponder together about like what is so beautiful specifically about that. Like, why is that particular prayer going to be mashhud for us or witness for us? And then the other real,
just to translate a little bit of this. So that this is a reading of verse 78, which was recited, that performed the regular prayer. And one of the things we talked about yesterday was the prayers were prescribed to the Prophet, the 5 daily prayers, when he made the night journey. And so here it is said, perform the regular prayers in the period from the time the sun is past its zenith till the darkness of the night, and then the Qur'an al-Fajr, which is the prayer at dawn,
pre-dawn.
But in that prayer before sunrise, it's called the Qur'an al-Fajr, because you should lengthen the Quranic recitation. And there's a distinction given to that morning prayer that it will be a witness. But also here we see that there are actually 3 kind of times given, and the tradition will give us 5 because there's a number of prayers that come from the passing the zenith until night. But this is one of the reasons we have differences amongst the schools of thought as well on whether it's 3 prayers or 5, or the 5 that are combined into 3. But by most of us, most of the tradition will uphold the 5 prayer. Sorry, just to clarify for the audience that wasn't necessarily maybe following the Arabic text. Keep going.
And then like few verses later, obviously there's a beautiful dua too, right? وَقُلْ رَبِّ أَدْخِلْنِي مُدْخَلَ صِدْقٍ وَأَخْرِجْنِي مُخْرَجَ صِدْقٍ وَاجْعَلْنِي مِنْ لَدُنْكَ سُلْطَانًا نَصِيرًا. I don't know if you want to translate that, Mahan.
Yeah. So a dua is a supplication, and this is a prayer of the Prophet that, as I understand, when he entered Medina. And so the emigration from Mecca to Medina, because the Prophet was more or less driven out. But we'll see, I don't know if we'll read those particular verses tonight, that had the Prophet actually been driven out, then the people of Quraysh would have had their punishment, like all of the prophets. because God doesn't change that sunnah. And so the Prophet left before, of his own accord, and it kind of delayed that punishment for them, if I read this correctly. But when he enters Medina, almost as a refugee, and he has helpers for him in Medina, he has this prayer, which is verse 80, and the translation is, "Say, my Lord, make me go in truthfully and come out truthfully, and grant me supporting authority from you." Yeah. So
these next two verses are the verses I often used, Dr. Mahan and Dr. Timothy, when I'm talking about the spirituality of social justice. So in the verse where it says وَقُلْ جَاءَ الْحَقُّ, like, the actual like Arabic is so beautiful too, and we don't have time to get into that, but it's profound. It's like, and say, right, Mahan, you can actually do the translation because I don't have the English in front of me, but that,
yeah, and say that truth has come and falsehood has passed away.
Yeah.
And falsehood is bound to pass away.
Yeah.
وَنُنَزِّلُ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ مَا هُوَ شِفَاءٌ. So even when we are standing, right, we do the standing in وَأَقِيمُ الصَّلَاةِ, and we're going to see later as well of this idea of the Ashab al-Kahf, the people of the cave, how they stand for something, right? It's this idea of being qa'im, being like standing up for something. But that standing up is also in the same vein of the spiritual reservoir that we are required when we're standing up in prayer. And it's almost, to me, it's like they're married to each other, right? This idea that, can you really do this work of social justice, in which the Prophet, all of the Meccan surahs are pretty much about that, right? There's this idea of changing the paradigm, shifting the paradigm of the status quo, not allowing for faith to be exploited. So, but as you're doing that, right, you have these like verses about saying, say that truth has come and falsehood has perished. But then it's like then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bringing back this idea of, but here's what you hold on to. You still hold on to the dhikr, still hold on to that spiritual reservoir. So when I'm talking to some of my students about like what's happening right now in our context, is that, the Qur'an as it's revealed, it's, we fast, but fasting doesn't even actually occur. If you look at the trajectory that Dr. Timothy mentioned about the chronology of 23 years, fasting doesn't even occur, we say, until maybe at the end of first, second year. So what are the Muslims doing up until then, right? So prayer is a foundation, and Qur'an becomes so part and parcel of how they understand what it means to be a person of spirituality, is actually enacting what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the divine has asked us to do. You cannot do it without having that sense of connectedness to that revelation, to that tradition, through that recitation, through that. So building that reservoir, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I love in this verse 82 too, how we also see that the Quran is not just a book of instruction, but it's also a book of healing and a book of mercy. This recitation is itself a healing and a mercy to those who believe. And this is really interesting, because we're almost speaking of the Quran in a way that is supernatural, right? That it's a book that has these powers, right? It's a book that has this. It's a recitation that has this medicinal quality. It has this consoling quality. It's not just, people sometimes get frustrated when people are learning to memorize the Quran without understanding the Arabic, and because it's important to understand what we're reciting, but also I think it's important to understand that it's not just a book of grammar in lessons and that can be extracted. It's also it's more holistic than that, and it's more comprehensive than that. So it's a really powerful verse.
No, and we're getting into the sequence of about 4 or 5 verses that are about human nature. So I'm just going to translate them so people can kind of hear what is being recited that we heard some of, but not. I'm going to go beyond what was recited, and then let's discuss maybe this last part of this surah, and we should jump to Al-Kahf, the next surah, so we can continue to advance. But here's the verse you were referring, Dr. Timothy, 82. We send down the Qur'an as a healing and a mercy to those who believe. But now here's the twist. The second part of the verse is, as for those who disbelieve, it only increases their loss. When we favor, that's the next verse, when we favor man, which is actually the human being, right? Al-insan, he turns arrogantly to one side. So he's been favored and he turns arrogantly, and you're going to see some of this exfoliate perhaps in Surah Al-Kahf. But when harm touches him, he falls into despair. Like instead of being grateful and patient, it's like the wrong response. And then it's about human nature. I mean, everyone does things their own way. Or the other translation is everyone acts according to his own disposition. Shakila, the shakla, the mold. I almost think of this as a genetic, we're all genetically coded in our unique way and socially formed, right? And so we're going to act based on that formation and that mold. Shakila. But your Lord knows who is best, who it is that is best guided on the way. And so someone may respond badly and you judge them, but only God knows that, they had a terrible accident or they lost someone that morning. You don't know anybody's circumstance, right? Or their mold. And so only God can judge. And then this 85 is incredible. You wrote your thesis on this, or at least part of it, dissertation. But before I read it, on the occasion of Revelation, I recall, one of the occasions of this was that a group from Medina came. It's a group of Jewish people who had heard of the Prophet in Mecca. So this revelation is still in Mecca, and they came. They're like, let's test him. So they asked him 3 questions. One was about the spirit, the ruh. One was about the people of the cave, which we'll see in the next surah. And one was about Dhul Qarnayn. And the Prophet ﷺ said, I'll tell you tomorrow. And we'll see that he didn't get the revelation on these things for much longer than one day. It was several days, maybe even a couple of weeks. And then in the next surah, we'll see God telling the Prophet, don't say you'll do anything, and to all of us through the Prophet telling us, you'll do something tomorrow. Illa an yasha Allah, except if God will. This is why Muslims always say inshallah to everything. And so that's some of the occasion as well. And here's the verse on the, one answer on the ruh.
Yeah.
So you will all act according to your mold, your disposition, but only your Lord is fully aware of who follows the best guided path. They ask you, see, this is the occasion. The people came, they ask you about the spirit, the ruh. The word here is, when Adam, he formed Adam and he breathed into him his ruh, his spirit, God's spirit. So say the spirit is part of my Lord's domain, min amri rabbi, or it is by the command of my Lord. It comes by the command of my Lord, min amri rabbi. And you have been given only a little knowledge.
Yeah.
And so that's it. He doesn't say more about the ruh. And I'm just going to read the next verse and maybe we can talk about this. If we pleased, this is really, I feel, striking, because this is now addressing the Prophet in the singular. If we pleased, we could take away that which we reveal to you. Ilayka, the Prophet. Then you would find no one to plead for you against us. So I've read this many times, but this is the first time it kind of really hit me that it's such a strong illa rahmatan min rabbik. So no one could you would have no one to plead for against us, you against us, except by the mercy of
Your
thy
Lord.
Lord. For his bounty to thee is indeed great.
Yeah, his fadl.
Right. And this is the last two I'm going to read from this sequence, and then let's see if you'd like to discuss any of this. Say, now the prophet is being told to say, the revelation comes, tell them, even if all of mankind, humankind, and the jinn, which is another species made of smokeless fire, we haven't talked about them much, and وَكَانَ مِنَ الْجِنِّ, this Iblis who deceived Adam, we'll see in the next surah, could have been from amongst this group, although he was worshipping with the angels. Even if all of mankind and jinn came together to produce something like this Qur'an, they could not produce anything like it, however much they helped each other. In this Qur'an, we have set out all kinds of examples for people. Min kulli mathal. Yet most of them persist in disbelieving. All right, that's my sequence here. What do the two of you think as you hear this?
Wow. It's full. I spent many years on Ayah 85, and it's the emergence of what Imam Ghazali calls the secret of the ruh, the secret of the spirit. He said that even if one were to come to discover it, it's forbidden to speak of it, because even the Prophet, upon him be peace, was not allowed to say more than this, that it is from the Amr. It's either from the command of my Lord, or part of the command of my Lord, or it is my Lord's business. In that case, Amr is like Sha'n, it's like a matter. But however we read it, or however we want to take it, it does acknowledge that, and it reminds us that at the very core of our human existence, at the very core of our human identity, there is something ineffable. And that ineffable something is the ruh, is the spirit that God has breathed into the human form. And so it's just a beautiful, beautiful verse. And these other verses that you have included, right? Even the verses that point to the inimitability of the Qur'an, this idea that the Qur'an cannot be fabricated, it cannot be imitated. It's even when the pre-Islamic Arabs were saying it's poetry, and the Qur'an is responding to those arguments, the Qur'an is saying that, go and try to produce something like this, and you will not be able to. So there is something also enigmatic and inimitable about this recitation that we've heard tonight, both in Arabic and also in English translation. So these are both, powerful mysteries that we live with as Muslims.
There's so much to say about this topic, but I think obviously, Dr. Timothy, this is, mashallah, your area of expertise. I was curious about, because there's, many scholars who actually, including Imam Nawawi, who my understanding is that a ruh, it was Jibreel alayhi salam, is actually
that's one of the ways.
One of them.
Yeah.
Because when we get to sort of what we call Surah al-Qadr, تنزل الملائكة والروح, right? So ruh in that case is supposed to be Jibreel alayhi salam. So there is some level of consensus amongst at least Sunni scholars that on Laylat al-Qadr, the ruh that the Qur'an is referring to, that actually comes down once a year and continues to come down once a year, is actually Jibreel alayhi salam. But what's beautiful to me about the hadith on this, over and over again, and Dr. Mahan, you kind of mentioned this a little bit, is when this group of scholarly Jews, to my understanding, come to ask these questions, they are trying to verify whether or not the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is divinely inspired, truly or not. And if he's going to say, like, just make up stuff, or is he actually going to say what God is revealing for him to say? And they actually go away with a sense of sadaqt, right? Like they know he's not just making this stuff up. And
Right.
so you also mentioned that, saying inshallah as part of that process, it to me is, subhanallah, so profound, because it for us, that example starts with the Prophet ﷺ, right? So when we are constantly talking, and I've heard you both go back and forth for the last few days about qadr, and like, what is that, and how do we wrap our heads around it? And so something I want to
Qadr.
park, and it's
Yeah.
a much
Qadr,
yeah
Qadr, like God's divine decree, the predestination and free will, that topic.
that conversation, we can park this, but the idea of insha'a versus like qadr, right? So Allah, when we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills something, or it allows for something, versus it didn't say in qadar Allah, right? It said inshallah. And so what is that uniqueness? What does that actually really mean? Is there, because of that linguistical difference, does it change anything, or how we understand those verses or not? But that's, again, like I said, we could park that for another time.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I think, and Dr. Faryal went on that. She explained that everything happens within divine will, even when he allows us to, God allows us to roam with a degree of freedom that is a freedom that God has willed, and so nothing happens outside of his will. And so that coheres nicely with what you're pointing out in terms of word choice, where we say inshallah if God wills, rather than if God decrees. So that's an important distinction that you point
to. My patrons of distinction, we are now at 37 minutes past the hour. It's amazing how rapidly these moments of engaging the Qur'an and engaging each other for love of the Qur'an, how rapidly these evaporate. But maybe Dr. Mahan, you can take us into Surah Al-Kahf and the Surah of the Cave, or the people of the cave, and at least get us started tonight.
Yeah, we can. You already have got a sense that it's somehow related to the previous surah because of the occasion of revelation. And a number of the surahs, they come in pairs, and we haven't highlighted this relationship, but there's scholars who talk about them, like Mustansir Mir or Amin Ahsan Islahi and Farahi. Some pairs are more obvious than others. So the first, after Al-Fatiha, the first surah, the first two big ones, the Baqarah and Al Imran, there's a clear pair relationship, structural. We pointed some elements out from that. Also, An-Nisa and Al-Ma'idah, just in even how they begin. Ya ayyuhan nas, ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. Similar style of beginning, but complementary in meaning. Similarly with Al-Anfal and Al-A'raf, two Meccan surahs, one reminding through the signs of God in nature, one through the signs of God in the historical, annals and stories of the Prophet. And then we also saw Anfal and At-Tawbah, early Meccan, early Medinan, late Medinan, the start with Badr and the end with Hunayn and the conquest of Mecca. So you can see these pairs. And so the reason I point that out together right now is because you can also see another very clear pair relationship between Isra, which we just finished, and Al-Kahf, where we're going to. And its most obvious sign is just in the very beginning. So I'm just going to mark that as we begin reading this. When we read Al-Isra, you saw the beginning was Subhanalladhi asra bi abdihi laylan. So glory be to the one who took his servant by the night. And now look how Al-Kahf begins. Alhamdulillah alladhi. And Subhanallah and Alhamdulillah, glory and praise, they go together. So there's the complementarity. And there the servant was taken by the night. Here the Quran is sent down, brought down. So the Alhamdulillahi alladhi, not asra bi abdihi, anzala ala abdihi al-kitab, who sent down to his servant. There the servant was taken, here to the servant was sent down the book. And so this is, there's an infinite level of parallelisms you can draw throughout once you start thinking about it. But I just wanted to allude to it, so as we enter it, you can get a glimpse of some of the structural and thematic elements that otherwise, on a surface reading, are not always readily apparent. And here again with the book, so he sent down his servant the book, and made it unerringly straight. وَلَمْ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ عِوَجًا. This Surah Al-Kahf we're told to recite every Friday, and especially towards the end of time when things are fuzzy and we really don't know how to interpret events, and it's almost apocalyptic or a kind of breakdown. And so this is, you'll see a series of stories in this surah that are have layers of meaning and are very, very enigmatic. And among them, so I'm not going to read some of the beginning, but I'll just point out those surahs, and then Dr. Timothy and Ustadha Tahera, I'll let you take us wherever you want to go in this surah in the time that we have. But the first story is the the youth who are of the cave, the people of the cave. They have an oppressive situation, and so they're told to retreat into a cave, and they pass centuries there. Maybe the plain sense reading of this is that this is, youth are vigorous and they are active, but in this case they're being told to retreat and withdraw because there's no benefit coming from an engagement. Wallahu a'lam. Then the second story is the story of the garden, where there's a wealthy person and he thinks his wealth is everything, and it also makes him doubt his Lord. And so one is of the youth who are pious and retreat. One is of the wealthy person who gets lost in his wealth. Then there's the story of Moses and Khidr. Moses, the prophet, encounters a teacher who knows more than him. And so this episode, this encounter is about knowledge.
Yeah.
And then the final encounter is Dhul Qarnayn, which has to do with power, political power. And so you can see the different kind of lessons in the different domains have been put together here. They're very obscure and difficult to interpret. But in the beginning and the end of the surah, you have a common theme that comes, which is perhaps in verse number 7, we have made everything, we have adorned the earth with attractive things so that we may test people to find out which of them are best in conduct or do the best. And in the end of the surah, you will see, the Quran will ask, should I tell you, it tells the Prophet to ask the people, should I tell you of those who are in greatest loss with respect to their deeds? It's those who lose, who expend all of their energies in the life of this world. الذين ضل سعيهم في الحياة الدنيا وهم يحسبون أنهم يحسنون صنعا. And they think that they're doing good things, but they're actually completely consumed in this material world, and that's where they lose everything. So that's an intro, a thematic, and also some topical. And let me just turn it back to the two of you.
Wow,
what can we do?
That's a beautiful overview and summary, Mahan. I have to say that it's that's a hard one to follow. That was a beautiful synthesis of going through the parables, and what's really interesting to me is the Quranic use. I know scholars of the New Testament talk a lot about how Jesus taught in parables, but here we also see that the Quran is also teaching in these parables, these teaching stories, and some of them, as you said, are very 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 deep and very, very difficult to completely to decipher in a decisive way. But it's and these are all, you know, just amazing parables. I think that of the parables, although all of the lessons are so profound, but I love this encounter with Moses and the spirit guide, whom tradition names as Khidr, but the God sends this enigmatic figure to meet up with Moses and to instruct him, to almost initiate him in a much deeper form of knowledge than anything Moses had hitherto known. And we're talking about Moses. I mean, we're talking about a prophet who spoke directly with God. We're talking about, so Moses is sort of representing the best of humanity in a way. And even Moses's knowledge is shown to be so partial, and Moses's tendency to judge without a complete understanding is so apparent here. But in a way, if Moses didn't have the patience to wait for the full revelation of God, then in a way we're all lined up behind Moses, making all kinds of judgments about situations that we really don't fully understand. And I don't know if we have time tonight to walk through this initiation of Musa, upon him be peace, but it's an incredible story.
Yeah, I think it would be good for people to at least hear one of them, so we get a sense. There's a pattern. There's 3 encounters that he has.
Yes.
But there's a pattern where his teacher says, he says, you know, I'm supposed to come learn from you. And the teacher says, you won't be able to be patient with me. And so he says, no, give me a chance. It's all right, fine. And then they go, and then he does something that's incomprehensible to Moses, where he sinks a ship, or he kills a boy.
No, it starts with the ship, with the boat. Yeah.
Yeah. So Moses said, well, what are you doing? He's like, look, I told you, you're not going to be able to get what I'm doing. And so there were always hidden meanings where, had he not destroyed the boat, you know, far worse things would have happened. And in each case, that's the pattern. But Moses is not able to understand. And perhaps the lesson there is that, you know, one of the most common things I encounter with people is they say, why has this happened?
Yeah.
Why me? Why does God do this? Right? That's Moses and Khidr. I mean, that's a classic. That's the archetypal Moses and Khidr encounter. And we'll never know. And I think at least we won't know in this world. And maybe what the Qur'an is telling us is, don't even try. Some things you'll never know. You just have to kind of accept that there's a greater sovereign who's at work. And, there's the way that the previous surah ends. قُلِ الْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ الَّذِي لَمْ يَتَّخِذْ وَلَدًا. So praise be to God, belongs to God who has no offspring. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ شَرِيكٌ فِي الْمُلْكِ. And has no partner in his rule. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ وَلِيٌّ فِي الظُّلِّ. So this idea that he has no partner in his rule, right? Don't even try to. If you believe there's a ruler, and he is the governor of affairs, and you don't understand something, you can be at peace if you accept there's a ruler who's got it. But if that's, not there, then we're going to second question everything. There's some things we're not going to get. I don't know. I'll stop there. Ustadha Tahera, go for you. Tell us something from this.
Well, I think I just wanted to actually go back to how you started the surah, since I think we're just trying to, maybe in the last 10, 15 minutes we have left. You mentioned something really important. I think I just want to make relevant to our listeners about Surah Kahf. And most of us have heard of this and know this, but from the hadith of the Prophet, there's so many places where the significance of reciting Surah Kahf, in particular, as you mentioned, Dr. Mahan, at the end of times, or the end of this idea of like protection from Dajjal. So I want to remind us that the Prophet, in a Sahih hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, we are told to at least memorize the first 10 ayat of Surah Kahf for protection from the time of the tribulations of the end of times, and that anyone who recites Surah Kahf from one Friday to the next, the Prophet ﷺ said in a Sahih hadith that there will be a light shining from them. And again, there's like different opinions amongst the scholars about what does that really mean. When I just like recently reread the surah, I was thinking a lot about and I just loved how in the beginning you compared the beginning of Isra and then the beginning of Kahf. I didn't think of it that way, so that was really cool. Thank you for that. I think about how the juxtapositioning of like going from where the Prophet is ascending to heavens, but then all of a sudden the scenery goes back into the cave, right? So almost like back into this retreat. And that is actually where the Qur'an is first revealed, right? In this idea of he's retreating back into the cave. He's right. That's actually where the Qur'an's revealed. But the whole purpose of the Qur'an being revealed is not so the Prophet could retreat back. It's actually going back out, right? It's actually going back out and preaching to his own people. So in my reading, at least in the tadabbur I've done, is I think Surah Kahf overall deals with like 4 types of fitna or fitan, which would make, how do you translate that? Like trials,
maybe.
Tribulations, yeah.
So I would say like fitna of shirk. So that's the whole story of like the 7 young men, and some scholars say that's modern day Ephesus, wherever that is. Yeah, and I've been there, so it's kind of cool. There's all these like caves that they take you to and say this is possibly where they were. And how many years we don't know. Even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says like don't focus on that, right? Like when you recite the beginning of Kahf of how many years were they there for, or who was there, what was the name of the dog, things like that aren't as relevant. And if you notice the rest of the Quran, it doesn't necessarily always give all these details, even though there's like parables in it. Even the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, for us, it's in scenes and they move very quickly, right? So even the story of Musa alayhi salam with Qidr or Al-Qadr, we see more in the Shi'i as well as Sunni like hadith literature about like more about him versus in the actual Quran. And like people are really, I think, obsessed in some way with like who was he, this mysterious, magical, magnificent person. And there's actually quite a lot of interesting differing opinions about like, does he still exist? Is he still around? Ibn Kathir obviously doesn't believe that he's still alive, but there were some scholars who actually believed that like he was still around even when the Prophet passed away, that he came and met Imam Ali radiallahu anh. And so in the Shi'i tradition, there's an interesting, and I'm not obviously part of that, so I can't speak too much, but I just want to point out to our viewers and listeners that there's a very interesting conversation about him, but it's not necessarily in the Quran. It's obviously in hadith literature. Anyway, going back to the fitna of shirk, then the fitna of money, the garden story, the fitna of knowledge. I think that's in the story of Musa alayhi salam. And then finally, it's the end with the Qarnayn. I think it's about the fitna of power. And so all of these things, the 4 areas that humans are tested with. And in the stories, you also see how you can be protected from those things. So even like the first 10 verses, my teacher always said, the secret of Surah Kahf is right in the first 10 verses, where the young men are asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their dua, رَبَّنَا آتِنَا مِن لَدُنْكَ رَحْمَةً وَهَيِّئْ لَنَا مِنْ أَمْرِنَا رَشَدًا. And it's actually, some scholars recite that when they recite Surah Kahf, they recite it 3 times. It's, if you go to the Muslim world, they'll recite it.
Ustadha, translate that dua, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can do it, but Mahan, you want to just read out the translation?
Sure. Our Lord, grant us your mercy and find us a good way out of our ordeal.
That's
okay,
nice.
fast forward the story of Musa. Okay, here's what I think is really cool and relevant to our time, right? And I've talked to like Gen Z and millennials about this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses, and I don't know if you guys find this, like if you've done tadabbur on this, right? The word ittaba, right? Musa alayhi salam says, I want to follow you. And he uses this, like, if you think about the postmodern context, it's so interesting to me that like that's what we do right now. We follow people, right? And I just find that really interesting that that's actually the term, because when I
Oh,
was
that's
younger and I
so
would read,
interesting.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry?
you. That's so interesting. Like we
Yeah.
follow on X or Twitter, and
Mm.
follow me on Instagram or even on LinkedIn. You can follow actual feeds,
Mm.
and so just the word that comes, um, you point as you point out in the surah. There's a repetition of this where Moses follows Khidr, and then other places as well. I'm just trying to keep the group that may not fully grasp the linguistic aspects with us. We keep going. This is very interesting. And by the way, we're kind of at time, so
Yes.
we'll finish this thought and then we'll wind down. But go ahead.
Mm.
So a couple of things I've been really, really thinking about, right, is this idea of like, okay, so Dr. Timothy, you just mentioned this, right, is that here's someone who is a person who we say spoke with God, right? Musa Kalimullah, right? And then and we also understand, I don't know if there's full agreement on this, that when did this actually happen? Was it pre-Pharaoh or post-Pharaoh? So this is like after he's accomplished a great ordeal, right? Like, let my people go. And he's at this peak of his life almost, right? And then now he's told, well, guess what? You actually don't know. Someone knows more than you, basically.
Mm.
In the Hadith literature, actually, we find that Khadr alayhi salam actually is humble, and he actually tells him, I know some things more than you, and you actually know some things more than me, O Musa, right? So there's this complementation. My reading, though, subhanAllah, every time I get to this part is like this like magnificent person. Basically, Musa alayhi salam still says in satajiduni insha'Allah, right? So that word comes back again, or that phrase comes back again. So, it's something to think about, is like, okay, so even Musa alayhi salam is recognizing that I'm going to try to be patient, insha'Allah,
If God
right? If
wills.
God
Yeah.
wills. But here's what I want to think, leave us with, right? Here's, Musa alayhi salam still has to sit in the discomfort of not knowing. And when I read these verses, I remind myself that sometimes not knowing is a blessing, right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you don't have to know everything, because sometimes not necessarily knowing certain things could actually be a great blessing for you. And while it may cause some level of discomfort, there is always, we believe, divine wisdom in that process for us. And it's hard. But if Musa alayhi salam in the Qur'an is that example for us, that look, he's had to sit in that discomfort as well. And he obviously, like Dr. Timothy pointed, that if, he's a great prophet and we're kind of, following behind him. But his story is supposed to be an example for us. So even Musa alayhi salam had to sit in discomfort of not knowing. And maybe, as we don't know certain things, and maybe that is meant to be something that allows us to recognize that in that time and in that space, that actually could be a source of healing for us, and not a cause of anxiety, if you view it in that way, right? Last thing is,
go ahead.
There's actually interesting conversation amongst the scholars around when we talk about like destiny and qadr Allah, where it says وَكَانَ أَبُوهُمَا صَالِحًا, that the parent, the reason that certain that in the story of the how he goes through each parable, one of the reasons that's given that, and Mahan, maybe you can, Dr. Mahan, you can actually go to that part. I think you know what I'm talking about.
It's when he killed the youth. Yes.
Yes. And he says, basically, وَكَانَ أَبُوهُمَا صَالِحًا. Where am I? كان وراءهم ملك يأخذ قسما من غنم فكان أبواه مؤمنين فخشينا أن يكون
81. So, and we desired that the Lord would give them in exchange a better son. Yeah, in ayah 81. Yeah.
So in ayah 80, so 82, where it says, وَأَمَّا الْجِدَارُ فَكَانَ لِغُلَامَيْنِ يَتِيمَيْنِ فِي الْمَدِينَةِ وَكَانَ تَحْتَهُ كَنْزٌ لَهُمَا وَكَانَ أَبُوهُمَا صَالِحًا. This, is very interesting to me that's actually one of the reasons given, right? So we know from our understanding of, many scholars talk about like the fiqh of like, if your parents did something wrong, does it actually impact the child? We know that every that does not get passed, right? The sins of our parents don't get passed down to us. However, if your parents are actually good, can there be a positive impact to the generations that come? So that actually, this particular verse is often in engagement and conversation around that topic. While the reverse doesn't work, the idea that if you have salihin, the parents who are salihin, it can actually have a good impact on the generations.
Mm-hmm.
I'll stop there.
Okay, that's beautiful. And just just to dovetail with that in a kind of final thought, that one of the really impressive things about Moses here, I mean, obviously he gets caught up in judgment without full information. And so he gets caught 3 times imposing judgment, and he's told 3 times, you've judged without understanding. So in a way, he's kind of showing us, right, what we're doing all the time is we're judging things without full knowledge. But what really impresses me is that this prophet who spoke with God and spoke, spoke power to Pharaoh, he sees somebody in the desert who knows more than he does. And instead of saying, yeah, I know stuff too, he's like, will you please take me on as a student? Will you, the epistemological humility, the sense that, wow, I found someone who knows something. Clearly he knows something that I don't know. Would you take me as your student? And I promise I'll be patient. Like he's totally, it's like those kung fu movies when students come to a great master and he says, no, I won't take you. And they'll say, please, please, no, I won't take you. And they sit outside his door for day after day after day until finally he says, okay. And so, but Moses has that kind of spirit, that humble spirit of seeking knowledge. And so the one thing we can only imagine that after these encounters and after all these perplexing scenarios, each time where Moses was caught in a judgment and he was corrected, that Moses then was left to kind of wander the desert in a sense of wonder. Like, wow, like the world is so much more complex and reality is so much more complex than anything that I previously thought. And so it kind of then kind of inspires us to walk with a sense of wonder and not to judge, but to say that, and we have to judge actions, and the Qur'an is very clear about that. We have to make choices, but we can never judge the totality of a human being, even if it's a human being that's done terrible things, or even like we don't have that picture. We don't have that knowledge. We can say that, well, this particular action is wrong, but again, we're kind of taught that like we don't have a complete picture, and so we have to be very careful about our judgments. Sorry, Dr. Mahan.
No. That's a great, that's really interesting way and relatable way how you put that encounter with Moses and the epistemological humility. I love that, and I, thanks to Ustadha for pointing out the various themes and this idea of shirk, especially because that's actually a major theme, and this is maybe where we can wrap it up. And then to close, this has been our longest night, but it's okay. To close, maybe you can recite Surah Al-Asr is what we've been closing out with, if that's okay with you. It's a brief surah and it's a good parting surah. And then hopefully we'll hear from you tomorrow again as we go into Surah Maryam, and maybe we can hear the 10 ayahs of Surah Al-Kahf. But if you look at how Surah Bani Israel ended, وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ شَرِيكًا فِي الْمُلْكِ, in the last verse, and he has no partner in his rule. And look at how the last verse of Surah Al-Kahf is. وَلَا يُشْرِكْ بِعِبَادَةِ رَبِّهِ أَحَدًا. And so the Prophet is told to command people that, I'm just a mortal, like أَنَا بَشَرٌ مِثْلُكُمْ, I'm just a mortal like all of you. And he's addressed as Asra bi abdihi laylan and Asra ala abdihi al-kitab. So the humanity of the Prophet is emphasized. So lest you elevate him, right? And only difference between me and other mortals is revelation comes to me. And whosoever hopes to meet his Lord should just do good deeds. Just do good deeds and don't associate. Don't do shirk. Don't associate. Like there was anyone in God's rule, and don't associate anyone in your share of worship with God.
Right.
Have it only to him. So this is a major theme of this, of the whole deen of the religion, but particularly you can see it accented in these two surahs. So
beautiful.
And I think, Dr. Mahan, what's important to note is, like, in the chronological order, and I know there's always difference of agreement around that, and I know we're at the end of this time, but I think it's important to know that Surah Isra and then Kahf, right? They're still considered Makki surahs, but they come chronologically after Surah Maryam. And Maryam now we're going to go to next, right? So in chronological order, Maryam actually comes before, right? Many scholars say that it comes right before they go to Abyssinia, right? In the possibly end of year 4, right?
Right.
But Wallahu alam, I think the beauty of that is you have these miracles happening, right? Miracles, like in all of these different, the two surahs, the Mi'raj as a miracle, what happens to the cave, the people of the cave as a miracle, Musa alayhi salam, and Al-Khadr, and all of that. And then the greatest miracle that humanity has ever witnessed is right about to come. So you guys have to join us for that, inshallah khair.
Tomorrow night. Great.
Yeah. Okay, Surah Asr, right?
Yeah, let's
أعوذ
start with
بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. صدق الله العظيم. Do I translate that, or you want to translate?
Mahan has a beautiful way of translating. Mahan, can you do that for us?
Well, it's, I seek refuge in God from Satan, the accursed, beginning in the name of God, compassionate, the merciful, is what's recited before any recitation. And then the surah is by the passage of time through the ages, or by the late afternoon, and at the end of the day when you're counting up how much I made, you're in a loss. You didn't make a profit. All this applies to all of humankind, except for those who believe and had righteous conduct and exhorted each other to live by the truth and to persevere in the face of hardship.
I mean, thank you all. Thanks
Thank you.
to those who have joined us tonight online, and thanks to those who will join us, outside of this moment, but on YouTube, and God willing, I'll get to see both of you, inshallah, tomorrow night. All right.
Inshallah.
Okay. All right. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum.